Now that we've mastered adding and subtracting with negatives, we're ready to look at multiplying and dividing with negatives. First, let's take a look at what happens when we multiply a negative by a positive number. Let's take, for example, if we do 3 times negative 2. Now, when we say 3 times negative 2, multiplication is really repeated addition. So this means we take 3 of these negative 2's. In other words, negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2. And we know when we're adding a bunch of negatives, we're just going to end up with a result that's even more negative. That's going to give us negative 6 total. Notice what happens, though, when I take a look at negative 3 times a positive 2. Now, this is a little bit different because I'm going to think about this negative separate from the 3 times 2. In other words, I'm going to have negative of these 3 times 2, or 3 groups of 2. Now, we already know 3 groups of 2 is going to be 6, and then we've got this negative out in front. So we end up with negative 3 times 2 gives us negative 6. In other words, as a pattern, what we see happening is if I have a negative times a positive, like in example B, we ended up with a negative result. Or if I had a positive times a negative, like in example A, we ended up with a negative result. That's going to be true regardless of the numbers. In other words, if I have 8 times negative 4, because I have a positive times a negative, one of each, the answer is negative, and 8 times 4 is 32. One more example. Let's do division. Let's do negative 45 divided by 9. Same rules. We've got a negative divided by a positive. The result has to be negative because we have different signs. 45 divided by 9 is 5, and so we get the answer of negative 5. So if we are multiplying a negative by a positive, if we have 2 different signs, the answer is always negative. But what happens when we multiply 2 negatives together? Let's take a look at the problem negative 3 times negative 2. Using much the same logic that we saw up above, that front negative I'm going to separate from the rest of the problem to make it negative 3 times negative 2. Now, when we do that, we end up with a negative in front of everything. And then 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. So we have minus a negative 6, and we know we can add the opposite to get positive 6 for our answer. In other words, we started with a negative, and we multiplied by a negative. And when we did that, the answer was positive. A negative times a negative is a positive. So for example, if I've got negative 11 times negative 10, 2 negatives are going to multiply to a positive, and now I just have to say 11 times 10 is 110. Similarly, with division, we've got negative 8 divided by negative 2. Because the signs are the same, we're dividing 2 negatives. The answer has to be positive. 8 divided by 2 is a positive 4. In other words, when we're multiplying 2 negatives, the answer is always positive. Now, I want to be really careful as we start talking about multiplying and dividing with negatives, because there's a set of rules we use for adding and subtracting negatives. And there's a different set of rules that we use for multiplying and dividing with negatives. Be careful not to mix those up when you're solving problems.